Well, it is now my pleasure to introduce Danielle Hilmo, Marketing Manager at BWBR. Danielle, the virtual audience is all yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am so pleased to introduce our guest speaker today, Ashley Shew. She is an associate professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech. She works in the philosophy of technology with emphasis on disability studies, animal studies, and emerging technology, and is particularly interested in stories about humanity, technology, and disability. Now, I first became acquainted with her work from her book entitled Against Technoableism, Rethinking Who Needs Improvement. And I really enjoyed her personal journey and how that informed her work and continues to inform it. And it was a really great book for me to read to understand what technology means. It's not what you think it is necessarily, spoiler alert. And so we're really glad that she's here to talk with us and teach us about this topic, which I think is underappreciated and underemphasized in our industry. Ashley's work has been featured in both scholarly journals and public-facing venues, and she's been a guest on 12 different podcasts in this past year. She is a proud founding member of both the Disability Alliance and Caucus at Virginia Tech and the Disability Resource Center of the New River Valley. So please welcome Ashley to the SMPS virtual stage.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to attempt to screen share while I speak. This is the most dangerous stunt I will do today. I think I did it. Did I do it? I'm hopeful. If I didn't, someone please unmute and correct me. But I think we're on my slides now. I have the prompt of accessibility in the built environment and beyond. And this is a topic that as a disabled person, I'm highly interested in. I read a lot of disability narrative for my work, which is stories disabled people tell, often stories that we don't see represented in larger media about disabled people or about technology. There I go. Thank you so much for having me today. My plan for today is briefly on this slide is to talk about technoableism and ableism, to talk about the stories that we tell, to talk about disabled expertise and sort of the context of our lives, living it against the backdrop of built infrastructure and societal expectations that don't always appreciate that disabled people exist, frankly, and then planning for disability forward futures. But first of all, well, who am I? Danielle has been kind enough to say a little bit about sort of my professional work. Here's the list of things I am as a disabled person. And one thing I want to say is that most disabled people are multiply disabled. So much research about disability, so many of our stories about disability in our culture have disabled people with just one disability, but the vast majority of disabled people are multiply disabled. That means most disabled people don't see representations of themselves in the world, but also in scientific literature and in technological design and in planning about our existence. So I think that this is actually really important to think about, and not just because I'm multiply disabled, but in so many of the stories I read that disabled people are writing, being multiply disabled and being cross-disability community are really important. So my list of things is I have chemo brain from a really heavy dose of a series of doses of chemotherapy 10, 11 years ago. I'm hard of hearing from that same chemotherapy. I am a rotationplasty amputee. It was bone cancer. They removed it. I have tinnitus, constant like screeching in my ears all the time. I have Crohn's disease, which is not related to the cancer, although most of the other things are. And I'm someone who works in cross-disability communities. So I have a picture of myself sitting on a rock, and I have a picture of the front of my book with lots of colorful wingdings. I love being in disability community. It is where I feel most at home. And the stories that we hear from multiply disabled people in community with other disabled people are so much richer than we hear in any sort of marketing to or about disabled people, or in any of the stories that sort of shape who we think exists now and in the future. Because so many times when we're writing about the futures that we're building, it reflects back on the things we're actually making. And it continues to chagrin me that so much of our science fiction pictures a world where disability is eliminated. Because the thing is, if disability is a long-term, historically long-term thing that happens regularly in the context of every society, every minority group. It is something you are lucky to be. You are lucky to be disabled if you are lucky to live long enough. It is something that is expected and regular, and we can expect more of in the future and not less. And I say this because with our impending climate change and the things we should be anticipating for, along with climate change. With climate change, we get changes in disease patterns. So we're getting things like Lyme disease and malaria where they haven't been seen before. This will cause an uptick in long-term disability. We're seeing with long COVID, new insights about sort of living as a disabled person for a longer period of time without a social structure yet that has caught up to that. I think about accidental injury types of causes of disability as something that will continue to exist. And perhaps we can expect more of when we have more dramatic climate events. We also know that there are higher rates of asthma than there used to be. That is a disabling condition as well. So while there might be some types of disability that the latest and greatest tech might be helpful for, where different diseases that cause disability might also be addressed through biomedicine. The thing is, even if all of that is true, the future is more disabled, not less. Even if we are working on individual disease related disabilities, we can expect more, not less disability. So I think it's really important to plan for and to think about and to reflect, not just in our marketing materials about architecture and engineering and construction, but to think about them in terms of how we want to shape and plan for the world that is surely coming, if we're lucky to survive as a species. So this is the plan. I need to pause for a moment and say, I'm a disabled person. It doesn't bother me if you have your camera on, don't look into the camera, if you need to use the captions. I love that they're recording this so you come back later. I feel like that's a really disability friendly thing to do, because sometimes our bodies are not constant in the way they are demanded to be by so many workplaces. And that's something we also need to consider. So I want to start out with a little anecdote about polls. 10 years ago, 11 years ago, 10 and a half years ago, I was regularly doing inpatient chemo at a particular university medical center that had gotten a whole new building. It was beautiful. Fresh new construction. We had been in some skanky old floor with the chemo patients were mixed with the other patients. And now we had several whole floors dedicated to chemo patients. So extra special filtration because we were so vulnerable. There was a room down where we could socialize because a lot of us would check in feeling all right, get chemotherapy and feel worse during the week. But there was times when we were just hooked up getting the chemo where we could actually interact with one another and visit with the recreation counselor. It was beautiful. It was a beautiful building. And they brought a lot of the old equipment. That included the poles that we move around with the chemo that we're getting the whole time we are inpatient. So I'm moving around with these new poles. I am an amputee at this point. I do not have a prosthetic leg. And even if I did, I was too fresh that it would have been bad to wear the prosthetic leg actually, because things were healing. And so I was rolling around with my wheeled walker and I had my pole and I could kind of sit and roll around like on a rolly chair with my pole so that I could leave my bed and go places. And I did. I was rolling around. But the thing that was part of the infrastructure is to roll in and out of the bathroom. And I was hooked up to liquids all the time to help protect my kidneys. So constant movement of water through my body. And in fact, we had to test all my urine and its pH because we really wanted to make my body very, very basic in order to protect my kidneys as I was getting high dose methotrexate. There was a slight lip to get in and out of the bathroom. And I had this pole that didn't want to do it. The wheels weren't right for just this small lip into the bathroom. And this small lip into the bathroom was on in all of the rooms. And I was a fairly young cancer patient. I was 30 when I was going through this treatment. And I could get in and out. I had to maneuver. I had to use extra strength. I had to like roll my little cart in and then roll my pole in so that I could have any privacy in the bathroom. And of course, curtains hadn't been installed yet on the windows. So you needed to shut the bathroom door. Otherwise, everyone who came by would get to watch you on the bathroom. And I remember like this was really hard. Some of the nurses really hated it. They commented on it. And new poles were coming. They had to order all new poles because of this little lip on every one of these surfaces. And it was just a small thing. It was a small thing that made a dramatic like problem in equipment because they needed things with bulkier wheels to get up and down this small lip to get in and out of the bathroom. And so I was checked out, checked back in. I was back for another week of chemotherapy. And one of the nurses told me that they were getting these poles a lot sooner. One of the patients had tried to roll it in with her and it had fallen over into her face. And this is a person getting chemotherapy. There's a reason she's in the hospital, but she actually had to get a whole bunch of stitches and the hospital was very worried about the liability if they continued to use the poles that they were using. There are things that disabled people notice about built infrastructure that can prevent a lot of issues. You know, as someone who has been on wheeled devices and looks down a lot when I walk, as someone who uses a prosthesis or uses a cane at different times too, has used double crutches, I notice all the bumps. This is something that if they had talked to anyone, they would have made sure that there wasn't going to be this lip, because it caused so much trouble for every person that was checked in for chemotherapy there. And it was this bright new building. We were all excited to be part of it and be in it. And there was this like fatal flaw to it all, right? We had to get all new poles, IV poles, which you use a lot of in the chemo building. And so when I think about the built infrastructure a lot, I think about all of the sort of preventative design that disabled people know about and think about in ways that non-disabled people couldn't even imagine, right? None of the architects on this project or the people who did the installation had noticed that this was going to be a huge problem for every user that went into this space. And it's not just consult your users. I want to say there's something specific about being disabled and having a different embodiment that lets you imagine what can happen in different scenarios or lets you notice things about the built environment. I think it's really important to talk about disability, particularly in this industry. It can prevent further disability and it can prevent death. But a lot of the things that disabled people know are not just like useful, something we should pay attention to. We're not doing accessibility just because it feels good. In fact, there is a lot of value add that disabled people and especially multiply disabled people and cross-disabled community can bring. So that's sort of why I'm so excited to be talking to you all today. My book is about this weird word, technoableism, which is a word I coined to describe a phenomenon that I think a lot of people in the disability world were already talking about. But to tell you what technoableism is, I'm going to tell you what ableism is. Surprise. So ableism, this is my favorite definition. It's from T.L. Lewis, and it is kind of a lengthy definition. Sometimes people say, oh, it's bias against disabled people is ableism. That's true, but that doesn't quite encapsulate sort of the wide reach that ableism has pretty much in everyone's life. So ableism is a system, this is from T.L. Lewis, a system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on socially constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in eugenics, anti-Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This systemic oppression that leads to people and society determining people's value based on their culture, age, language, appearance, religion, birth or living place, health/wellness, and or their ability to satisfactorily produce, excel, or behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. So it's all of these sort of presumptions. Sometimes people talk about this. Fiona Kumari Campbell talks about ableism as this trajectory of perfection, that we order people and order like even disability types with one another, that we order like who counts as good, who we want included, who we even think about when we go to plan things, is sort of embedded in all of these sorts of structures. And ableism has often been used to justify things like colonialism, right? That there are people who need to be controlled, who need the culture that the colonial force will bring in, that they are somehow, that this somehow suggests that there's a justification. We think about it also with white supremacy. White supremacy says that people of color are inferior, and that there's a hierarchy in terms of skin color and race that plays into specifically things like intelligence, but also things like problem solving, things like who produces the best offspring. These are all inbuilt to things like eugenics and white supremacy, and they're often justified by ableist beliefs about this hierarchy. So this is the sort of underlying concept of ableism that undergirds a lot of immigration policy. It undergirds a lot of like what we think is appropriate and good in a job interview. It undergirds who we think is good for what type of work and why. It undergirds our educational system in terms of attainment in many ways. And once you start seeing this, you start seeing it in a lot more places than you expect. The place that I'm interested in as someone who's interested in philosophy of technology has been in talking about the way in which we promote ableism through technology, or the way in which we market and share technologies in ways that actually reemphasize ableism, even when we say that they're going to be empowering. So my project in the book, Against Technoableism, is diagnosing this problem, this phenomenon. And this is another explanation where helpers and medical professionals and engineers offer their expertise to help disabled people, where the ableism is actually re-emphasized through the technological or medical solutions offered. Like what they think is a solution to the problem of disability presumes that disability is a problem. And in fact, most experts about disability are non-disabled people, re-emphasizing some of these values. This is often wed to the idea that disabled people want this intervention, and not just want it, but they need it to be empowered. They need technology to be empowered in their daily lives, with a background assumption being that being disabled makes you broken or suboptimal or inferior, and calling out for this technological fix or help. I think poets say it better. So I will quote from the cyborg Gillian Weisse, who is one of my favorite poets. And that is, they like us best with bionic arms and legs. They like us deaf with hearing aids, though they prefer cochlear implants. It would be an affront to ask this hearing to learn sign language. Instead, they wish for us to lose our language, abandon our culture, and consider ourselves cured. They like exoskeletons, which none of us use. They would never consider cyborg those of us with pacemakers or on dialysis, those of us kept alive by machines or made ambulatory by wheelchairs, those of us on biologics or antidepressants. They want us shiny and metallic and in their image. I really like the things that the cyborg Gillian Weisse writes, and I want us to notice all the ways our pop culture and entertainment and media processes disability in ways that point to fixing individual bodies and minds, in some ways reflected in what cyborgs, is saying here. We're often pointed not towards making better, more accessible, more inclusive structures. We're not pointed at changing the built environment usually. We are pointed at individual fixes to individual body minds to get them to be includable in the terms of Tanya Tchaikovsky, to actually change people's bodies or minds to make them worthy of inclusion, or to change them so that they behave more like non-disabled bodies and minds, so that they're performing the script correctly to be included. This points us away from talking about how to actually make inclusive spaces. Sort of one of the impacts, I think, of the technoableism that I'm tracking, is a diagnostic category that I'm tracking in so much of how our dominant culture talks about disability, really speaks against our architectural, our construction fixes, our solutions that are about the built environment and that are about sort of community participation in the world outside of a technological fix. Although I understand built infrastructure to also be a technology, the sort of technologies that anyone can use and aren't designed specifically in ways that suggest that some bodies are broken or don't belong is actually really, really important. We should see things like better acoustics, ramps and elevators, a standard, easy to find, part of the main structure and not an afterthought. Less sensorially overwhelming spaces, so spaces that bounce around sound a whole bunch or offer a lot of noise can also be really problematic. More easily navigable spaces, right, for blind people and for people who need the sort of navigation to find things. And this is beyond just signage. I think about some of the tactile pavers, and I've been indoors in places outside of this country where there's tactile information built into the floors of museums, right? So that blind people can participate in public life in that way too. I think about just changing out light bulbs for never using fluorescent bulbs because they set off people's seizures and migraines, right? What would it mean to design in ways that just take for granted that we're not going to include something that is a trigger for so many people towards their discomfort? Right. When I think about making accessible spaces, I feel like accessible is a kind of a low bar sometimes. What I want is a space that disabled people are involved in shaping in ways that materials that we pick out and things that we consider good are aligned with what the disability community wants. But also, once you do that, lots more people enjoy it. This is called the curb cut effect. So the current problem I see it, there's two things, right, that I want to refer to is that our stories suck. So much about disability that is written in the world is about disabled people needing help all the time. I want a built environment that doesn't require that, that I shouldn't need a helper to direct me different places. I don't care how nice that helper is. Being able to navigate a space independently is important for a lot of people. Or being able to not walk as far to get where you need to go. So often our disabled paths are actually much longer paths. So I think about a lot of the stories that get told, even as early as elementary school. I think about how Helen Keller, whose autobiography is called, or whose biography, not autobiography, is called The Miracle Worker. The literal name of this biography praises someone else. I think about how FDR, when we talk about disability in US history, for instance, his image was actually used to shame other post-polio survivors for not working hard enough to rehabilitate themselves so that they could do whatever they wanted to. But we know that FDR's image was actually hidden. He was carried up and down staircases to give speeches and things like that. So the image was very different than the reality. But so much of what disabled people are told from stories like this is that they need to pass or measure up. And I would like to have disabled people allowed to be as normal and tired as everyone else gets sometimes too, and not have to always be overachieving in order to be included. I think about how Harriet Tubman never gets credited as being disabled. So we have these cases where disability is very much part of the story. I think about where disability is also not part of the story. And here we have, so she never gets credited as being disabled, but she had this lifelong sleeping spell. She would fall asleep randomly, and this came because she had a violent blow to the head as a teenager from someone on horseback when she got between a runaway enslaved person and someone on horseback who was trying to catch them. In fact, the fact that she would fall asleep randomly makes her heroism on the Underground Railroad all that more fantastic. But it's written out of the story. This is something that is critiqued by some like Felissa Thompson and others as hashtag disability so white, right? That so many of our representations of popular culture are white people means that a lot of our stories about Black people with disabilities are erased. It's erased from the story of Harriet Tubman in some significant ways. I also think about the ways in which it gets stereotyped in weirder ways. I think about the poetry of Lynn Manning, who wrote this beautiful poem called The Magic Wand, where he talks about taking out his folded cane. He's a tall, blind Black man. I don't know if I've used all of those adjectives in the right order, but there's so many assumptions that people put on him as he walks by. One is that he must be great at basketball because he's very tall. He's a Black man. And once he pulls out his folded cane, right? He pulls out the cane, he's a blind man. He goes from Black man to blind man. And all of a sudden they think he's going to be really great at playing the piano, because sort of the only societal representation of Black blind men is people like Stevie Wonder and Ray Charles, right? This didn't come from nowhere, but the sort of presumption that all Black blind men will be great at the piano is probably an incorrect one, a misleading one. And I think about how these stories like end up impacting like who even gets to come out as disabled. There's so many ways in which revealing that you're disabled can mean a lot of social harm to you, a lot of workplace harm to you. Retaliation is a regular feature of disabled life, especially if you are asking for services of any sort. And I think about, what it means to be a good disabled person. The miracle worker has worked on you if you're Helen Keller. And of course, Helen Keller never grows up in any of our stories. And we forget the fact that she was a radical progressive cause championing socialist who had a long life past learning sign language at a young age. And here I think about sort of where our stories have led us, especially in the realm of technology. We have Bill Peace sharing that, and Bill Peace has a spinal cord injury. Your typical bipedal person exposed to a barrage of misleading news stories is led to believe all paralyzed people share one goal in life, walking. Please cue the soaring inspirational music accompanied by the brave and noble young men or women struggling to walk, surrounded by healthcare professionals, computer scientists, engineers who share the same ritualized ideal. The flip side, the gritty reality is not discussed, and disability has to be in this larger social context. Bill Peace is notable for writing a lot of work against the exoskeleton, which a lot of disabled people see as a replacement for actually remediating our infrastructure, which often privileges people who can walk and walk long distances and walk upstairs. The solution then isn't necessarily to build more stairs and hope exoskeletons work. That will be a lot of cost on individual disabled people who cannot afford exoskeletons and might not want them anyway. That we should have worlds where wheelchair users can just go. And in fact, the exoskeleton won't work for a lot of disabled people for various reasons. I think about this not just in terms of exoskeletons, although I've mentioned them a couple times so far. Jaypreet Virdi has done some wonderful work on deafness cures throughout history and can track 150 years of advertising about hearing-related technologies, and every single one for 150 years gets called a cure for deafness, whether it's an ear horn or quacky things like drops that you would put in your ears. It doesn't matter. All of the rhetoric and marketing around these hearing technologies keeps re-emphasizing that being deaf is bad, right? And in this interview I got to do with Jaypreet Virdi, this is a quote from it. This problem with this rhetoric about curing deafness, as we have seen over and over in history with various hearing technologies, is that it constantly promotes the idea that deafness is something that needs to be fixed, whether through medicine or technology. In all of these, there lies the idea that you have to fix it, have to be cured, rather than just accepting it. And that becomes problematic. I think this does something to you, and it makes deafness constantly stigmatized. So to be a deaf person in a culture where all of the advertising is featuring cures for deafness is really problematic. It also makes it harder for hard of hearing people to advocate for themselves, because people already presume what they'll want. This is why I think it's really important to talk to disabled people and think about acoustics, right? Not the latest and greatest. I have my hearing aids. I have taken out my hearing aids because there's a mechanical closet in my office that this picks up, and I actually hear better when I don't have my hearing aids in my office. Right there, in fact, they're actively not helpful and not just neutral in the circumstances of my office often, especially if I'm trying to hear other people on a Zoom. All right. So there's some context to all of this. There's a longer history of eugenics, of laws that keep disabled people from marrying one another, of laws that keep disabled people from being seen in public. We had 100 years of ugly laws in different municipalities. The last one was repealed in 1976, and ugly laws were laws. They existed from the 1870s to the 1970s. And these were laws that if you were someone with physical differences, and that could be amputees, that could be people with partial faces blown off in wartime, that could be anyone who looked sort of unsavory and might be considered a problem to be viewed in public. Ugly laws meant that you could be arrested for being in public as a disabled person. These were municipal laws, not federal, not state level laws, but ones that existed in a lot of cities. They were often targeted at racial minorities and at people who were suspected of being homeless. But the sort of underlying justification was that it was some sort of it was a moral problem to allow disabled people who were grotesque in this way to be seen, right? So we had come from an era in which we had 100 years where to be in public and be disabled was actually frowned upon. And disabled people still encounter this. One of my friends was accosted in a grocery store. He's a leg amputee, and someone was like, "Why are you out like you are without a leg on?" He was using a scooter. He had broken his wrist. He couldn't use his crutches. He couldn't use his prosthetic leg safely, and he didn't have one yet anyway, and he just wanted to go buy groceries. And some stranger was telling him that he was indecent to be in public without wearing a prosthetic leg, and that he needed to cover his leg and ideally get the right technology if he wanted to grocery shop. Right? This is not something that's gone away, even though I would love it to die too. We also have sort of conceptions about like who is good. So these ugly laws, I think, are significant, and it speaks to the way in which a lot of our social spaces don't account for disabled people coming there or being there. In fact, because some of them were designed to exclude people. It wasn't just from nowhere. In fact, disabled people weren't supposed to be in a lot of our spaces. I think about this sometimes in the context of the university that I work in. There's a number of buildings where there weren't elevators and they waited a really long time and eventually raised the whole building. But because they were Corps of Cadets buildings, and Corps of Cadets at Virginia Tech is a military training program with the presumption, of course, for the military that you are able-bodied. And they did not want to put in an elevator because that was seen as slacking. And I remember at one point I had to meet someone on the second floor of one of these buildings. It was mostly administrators in this building. It wasn't just a dorm or anything like that. And it was a meeting about accessibility. And I remember sitting out in front of the building and just like typing an email up where I was very angry. Like, you're having an accessibility meeting on the second floor of this building, but this is not, it's not in the past in many ways. And sort of presumptions about who's good go into ideas about who should get to procreate, not just who is here now, but who is here in the future. We see this with sterilizations. Virginia, my state, sterilized a lot of people during the era where that was more palatable. But the Supreme Court case that allows for sterilization, Buck versus Bell in 1927, has not been overturned. We see this, of course, with longstanding religious narratives where disabled people, we should be looking for cures, but miracles. That is, the way in which we redeem ourselves, and not sort of just including us because we are normal people who deserve to exist as much as everyone else. I think here, and this is where I talk about this poet, the cyborg Jillian Weisse again, has this wonderful quote: "For a while, all the experts on African Americans were white. All the experts on lesbians were Richard von Krafft-Ebing, and all the experts on cyborgs were non-interfaced humans." And this is where the poet Jillian Weisse says cyborgs belong to disabled people, right? That we are technologized human beings in a way that's never appreciated, or almost never, in the larger culture, that we might have something to say about technology beyond what non-disabled people have to offer in terms of talking about technology and infrastructure. I have a slide with the rough US eras and movements related to disability that I am going to skip over, but I just want to say that we are living in simultaneous eras. Even with disability rights, where we are part of a plan, right? Ideally, that people are using ADA checklists and specifications and web content guidelines. I read so many memoirs where disabled kids, like adults who are writing their memoirs, reflecting back on their youth, realize that they're going to be left to die in a fire or at school during a fire drill when they're left in the area of rescue, right? They're not given the same affordances to move about in their schools. This is something that dawns on way too many disabled kids who end up writing these memoirs as disabled adults, where they realize that the plan for them is probably death in an emergency. A lot of disabled people still feel this really heavily, where escape plans, architectural drawings, don't provide any escape for disabled people. We see this in second-class status, where we have to take longer routes to get into buildings, where we can't hear, but no one cares, where bathrooms are inaccessible and have no adult changing tables or lift. There are so many places we could talk about where they might have an accessible bathroom, but like there might be a whole campus where there's no bathroom, where someone who needs assistance in the bathroom or needs a diaper change as an adult, which is a thing that happens. There's no space for that to happen in a sanitary way. Where disabled seating doesn't exist, or where two disabled people can never sit together. Where steps change on the floor are not marked with high visibility, when columns block paths in stairs. There's so many access fails. And here I will flip just for a second. I have this picture up of this one theater on campus that I went into. It's a newly renovated building. I don't know if you can see the carpet. These are very steep stairs. And if you talk to like so many disabled people, I took this picture because you can see one of these seats is meant for disabled people, but you can't see the stairs because they chose this horizontal lined carpet. So you can't see where one stair ends and the next begins. This is a liability issue. And I told my university as much. But this is easily preventable if you just talk to a couple of disabled people and let them look at things before things are installed. And of course, the only disabled seating is at the very back of this theater. It is newly renovated. And my family sat down further while I sat up in the back. I told them they should go see. My kids are really into theater. I would like them to see what's happening in the theater, but I'm way in the back and separated from them. I'm not included. Yes, it's accessible. Is it inclusive? Not actually. I think about all of the access fails. And if you look at just the hashtag access fail on Twitter, people are looking all over at the infrastructure that they're invited into, but then not really invited into because of how it's set up. There's also this wonderful short film that I really like that is in the notes of the slides that I'll link at the end, where David Lepofsky of Ryerson, which is now Toronto Metropolitan University, takes you through a new award-winning building as a blind person and shows you all the things that he's gonna run into problems with. And it's a lot of things. This video is 31 minutes long, and he's every few minutes into a new problem with this award-winning, beautiful architecture, but it's not beautiful to disabled people who go there and can't actually move around in the way everyone else can. It's not equal access. So just to point those things out, and even the accommodations process. So even if we want to be included and we're willing to go through the processes to make it happen, these movements for inclusion often ask us to make ourselves includable, right? Anti-ableism in the workplace means being aware about structural forces and not just infrastructure, but a lot of times when disabled people use things meant for disability accommodation, we are outed to our colleagues, or we are certainly outed to our bosses about being disabled, who are part of the interactive process on these things. And it can mean there is retaliation or doubts about people's abilities, and a lot of the interpersonal social things that happen with that. So even when we're trying to use things meant for us, it can work in ways that out us as disabled if we have non-apparent disabilities, and harm can befall us from those things. So what I really want is a disability forward future, not just one where we allow access to disabled people, but one where we actively value the contributions of disabled people, especially in our infrastructure and planning. So a few notes on what not to do. I don't think these are ways to go about working towards a disability forward future. Disability simulation is the practice where you spend a day in someone's shoes with activities that you might perform blindfolded, or riding around in a wheelchair as a non-disabled person for a day, or simulating old age, or using VR goggles to simulate someone else's experience. The sociological data about disability simulation is it actually makes people more afraid about being disabled in the future. So even while they might go, well, this is awful, look at all of this infrastructure, it is terrible for wheelchair users or blind people, it doesn't immediately translate into, and those people deserve to be included, or any action like that, but it rather makes people doubt the abilities of disabled people. So people who do blind disability simulations is particularly bad for. Blind people, of course, learn how to be blind over time, right? They adapt. They learn different tricks for navigating the world and remembering things in the absence of being able to read something about, very quickly, or read a sign or something like that. There's lots of life hacks involved in being blind, where if it is your simulated first day of being blind, you're not going to adjust at all. So a lot of people who come off of these simulations actually think blind people are less competent, less likely to be able to live on their own, less likely to be independent than people who don't go through these simulations and might listen to blind people about their experiences. And a lot of disability advocates ask people to talk to disabled people about our experiences instead of pretending to be disabled, and then thinking that the situation. A lot of people who've had disabilities for much longer, of course, what you're simulating is your first moments with a disability, which are disoriented and scary. But disabled people adjust to the bodies and minds that they have. Design for disability, the 4 is an important part here. People now talk about designing with disability, that you want to enroll disabled designers and have people throughout your organization with disabilities in order to produce the best products, the best infrastructure. a lot of times disabled people are treated as objects or problems. That's obviously, I hope, problematic to people. And often there's sort of a savior complex. Anything anyone does about accessibility, it really grinds my gears, because so much of the university PR structure is, oh, we made something accessible. This is a big news story that often erodes the fact that disabled people complained about that spot for a really long time, or that it was built after 1990 and should have been up to code and it wasn't. I see this over and over, but they want to celebrate these projects in ways that, as someone in the disability community, I often find really ugly, and self-serving. You're, declaring yourself, having saved this particular population from this fate that has been experiencing this for a while, especially when we talk about physical infrastructure and bringing it up, not just to code, because sometimes you can bring things up to code and it's still not made in ways that are actually inviting, welcoming, even if it meets specs in particular ways. This is why I think the checklist approach only goes so far. What I really want to have us do in a disability forward future is look beyond tolerance, accommodation, and assimilation. Assimilation, of course, asks disabled people to pretend to be non-disabled as much as they possibly can and to fit into the dominant culture and not, be outwardly disabled as much as is possible to control. Disabled people have unique ways of thinking, being, perceiving, navigating, adapting that are really valuable if we're talking about AEC industries. Sometimes this is talked about in the deaf community as deaf gain, like you gain things from being deaf. And some of that is community, some of it is, it's sometimes better to be deaf under particular conditions. I think about the idea of deaf time, where deaf people at the end of the day take out their hearing aids and it's like a relief, right? Hearing is taxing if you are hard of hearing or deaf in a way that really goes underappreciated. Hearing loss, of course, is the term in the dominant culture. So they flip that on their head with the words deaf gain. I think about the neurodiversity movement that is this huge umbrella category for people with mental health disabilities, intellectual disabilities, cognitive disabilities, and then developmental disabilities like autism or ADHD. I fit into this community as someone with chemo brain, and this is a cognitive disability. And it's this way of talking about how we think differently from one another and from sort of the dominant culture, and what it means to actually value sort of nonlinear thinking, what it means to value some of the ways in which we work through the world with the minds that we have. I think valuing disability also means challenging compulsory able-bodiedness, right? Challenging systems and structures that make us be as non-disabled as possible to fit in. I think there's exchange in community and strength in knowledge with the inclusion of disabled people, and with disabled people generating our own knowledge about construction and the built environment and what works in architectural spaces. And of course, cross-disability understanding is really important to approaching all sorts of technology, infrastructure, and not. I think about Harriet McBride Johnson, who is someone whose work I really appreciate and has written a memoir, but this is from her book, Accidents of Nature, which is a novel about disabled kids at disabled summer camp. And one of them is thinking to herself, can a wheelchair be a choice and not a failure? Surely for most people, it makes sense to try to become as normal as possible. But what if normal isn't the only way to be? This is the sort of question that can apply more broadly to other modes of existence, communication, and movement. What if X isn't the only way to be? What if producing mouth words isn't the only way to be, right? And you might use an AAC device to communicate, an iPad or other app that might let you make words when it's hard to produce speech on your own. We should be trying to create spaces and places where more people can exist. And I think that is a huge thing to undertake, but one which I would love to see architectural, engineering, and construction firms take very significantly to build a world where more people can exist and exist comfortably. To not be asked to be non-disabled, to be allowed. To not be excluded or snuffed out or eliminated or presumed to be a problem or extinguished for being disabled or for just wanting the same thing everyone else wants. That's sort of the thing that really starts to get to me as a disabled person. A lot of what disabled people want is the same. Like we just want to be able to go the same places. We just want to be able to access the same concerts. We just want to be able to make art and not be gatekept about it. There's so many things that I think about that we pay. Like people pay large amounts of money to build buildings. They pay large amounts of money to transform landscapes, moving around tons of dirt to put in the building in the way they want it. We could be talking about a world where we're actually making these spaces in ways that it's not a retrofit and it's not just always an add-on to think about accessibility. We can positively value disability and disabled people. I have an image of Laurel Lawson and Alice Shepherd in their kinetic light dance. They have a stage that has all of these beautiful ramps, and they are wheelchair dancers who do amazing things with their bodies. Far more interesting than most non-disabled dancing. I don't know if you've seen the Paralympic breakdancing. It's so much better than the Olympic breakdancing. You're going to love the Paralympic breakdancing because to think about bodies as creative, as generative, and as good, to think about disabled bodies that way is something we so rarely get to see. And to do it in a celebratory and non-tokenistic way as well. The other is a sketch of that my friend Mallory McCain Nelson has of me using my walker in ways that the company who made it would not be pleased with, but I can go real fast on that walker. And here I'll quote from Leah Lakshmi Piepsna Samarasina, writing in Tonguebreaker. In the infinite crip crazy future, I am not eliminated and neither are you. We really are everywhere. Nothing horrible happens. You are not taken away. I am not left to die. We take care of each other forever. And that's what I really love in disability community and thinking in cross disability ways is actually seeing the sort of value we have for one another. So I will take questions. I'll pause there. My slideshow has more slides because I teach for a living and I always have more slides just in case. All right. I'm stopping share so I can look. Hey.
Thank you so much, Ashley. There was a very lively chat, which you were probably so busy enlightening us. But there are a lot of interesting comments that I copied down and I will share later. We did have a couple of specific questions. And we're getting the thank yous coming in as well. One question we had was, are there good resources for designers to help them determine when and how to start thinking about creating more inclusive spaces in a project? I can repeat that if you like.
You know, weirdly enough, I think there are some really wonderful ways of thinking about how we think about these things now and how that's a historical product. So I really like Amy Hamrai has this book called Building Access, Universal Design and the Politics of Disability, right? And actually takes a look at like historically how a lot of our specifications have come to be and have valued, you know, white male disabled people, right? So as a guide for thinking about a wider range of bodies than we sometimes even think about with concepts like universal design. Of course, universal design is this movement about designing for every body and often includes a lot of ideas about flexibility of use. I wish more people would do universal design. I also know that it won't go far enough. I won't go far enough because it is a movement led by non-disabled people about disabled people. It is that designing for disability and not with. And some disabled people will need different things than other disabled people. I think about tactile pavers a lot, mainly because I'm a janky walker and I might fall down. I also have earrings that are like fall risk signs, which that's an aesthetic I can rock. Because as someone who's used crutches a whole bunch, or whose foot, I can't feel the bottom of one of my feet, I'm more likely to go down in tactile pavers, but they're necessary at curb cuts because I don't want blind people to walk into the road. But it's a compromise. It's not like it's an elegant solution that suits everyone. It's a solution that mitigates harm, but it's also not very comfortable for me to use a tactile paver. Right. But that is a compromise that's been sort of built into ADA law. But I love the idea of flexibility of use, like, oh, we could have multiple pathways that people can take, and I don't necessarily have to use the tactile paver. I've gotten better at tactile pavers, but sometimes they're not great. Yeah.
Speaking of which, there was an off-topic question, but would you be willing to share about your earrings? I don't know. I mean, you said one of the reasons why you love wearing them. I don't know if this person is asking, like, where did you get them?
I mean, I got them where I get all my best disability gear, and that is Etsy. When disabled people are making things for other disabled people. I also have some great like hearing aid covers that have spikes out the back.
Oh my goodness.
And those are great. And also so many of the people who are making disability devices don't make them aesthetically lovely or pleasing. So there's like a whole cottage industry of disabled people who are making like covers for ostomy bags so that they're pretty and cute, or making my fall risk earrings. I don't know if they're meant for just disabled people, but I took that as like, this is my symbol. I'm a fall risk. I have a couple bracelets saved up from the hospital even. It is, you know, it's yeah, I get it on Etsy, although I'm sitting here next to like my construction vest, which I also think is a disability related gear, because I'm really afraid of being hit by cars when I'm walking around, as someone whose body moves slower, and sometimes my directionality, because I have a limp, it looks like I'm going one way, but that's just how my body moves before I can move in the way that I'm trying to go. So I'm always worried about my body being read in ways that put me in danger. So I have a safety vest, and of course the autistic community does love the headphones that you can't hear anything out of, like you're on a construction site. I feel like there's some really fun like crossover in like fashion and devices between like construction engineers and construction sites and the things disabled people might want to use. And for both, it's a safety matter. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I personally had a question about how we as a society eliminate the stigma associated with persons with disabilities in the workplace, everywhere, but specifically in the workplace, where if we see some kind of comment or behavior or something that really is not only not helpful to disabled people or whoever is being targeted, or even people talking behind, you know, others' backs in a group of abled people, and as a disabled people or an ally of a disabled people, what kind of action can we take in that context?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of great training about like bystander interruption of bullying and harassment that is out there. I think a lot of those things apply in the same sort of way. I also know that the construction industry is one that has fewer disabled people than most. Even though when we think about the construction industry, more people are likely to become disabled within that line of work. So if we talk about things like back injuries as common disabilities, when we talk about things like hearing loss, if you don't have your, you know, your noise canceling devices on, these are pretty common in the course of the construction industry. And it means people often retire early or are out on medical leave for long periods of time. I think about what it is to like normalize disability throughout all of our workplaces. You know, often disabled people are characterized as lazy, right? But if you're trying to get your back to heal, it's not being lazy, it's so you can do more work later. There's something to that. I think it's not like disabled people are radically different from non-disabled people. I think we notice a lot more. But that's a matter of sort of your disabled training, not necessarily anything sort of magical that's bestowed upon disabled people in a particular way. It's very practical. And different people have different ways of managing comments about their disability. This is a thing I see a lot in the amputee community, where I don't know why we all have to own silly t-shirts about our amputations, but the jokey t-shirts that everyone else is at ease. Like, oh yeah, I know I'm an amputee. We don't have to like have a conversation. It's like leg story, $10. They sell that at the Amputee Coalition. I appreciate that. I also really love the one that's some assembly required. And it shows like some extra devices around the person. So there's different ways of managing to make other people around you comfortable, but the onus always feels like it's on disabled people too. And just remembering we're regular can be really helpful with that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we are all people. I see Antonio's face there. I did want to just something that I recently learned. I read a book called This Chair Rocks, a Manifesto Against Ageism. It's a really good book, and the author is super funny. But she said, we all, if we live long enough, have a disabled future. But that doesn't change the people we are, because we are not able to do things in the same ways as we had been accustomed to doing them. And so I feel like there's a lot of intersectionality. You talked about white supremacy being part of this culture of having to live up to some kind of standard that, you know, we all should care about disability and ageism, because we all may be sitting in that chair literally in the future. So thank you so much, Ashley. We had so many awesome comments, and some people did ask this session has been recorded and will be available later for people to watch. So,
and I'm saving the chat now so I can read some of those comments. Thank you, everybody.
Absolutely. Impactful, eye-opening, challenging, interesting. It was amazing, and I knew it would be just from meeting you one time and speaking to you subsequently. So thank you, Ashley, for an amazing presentation. It was very needed. On behalf of Danielle and the rest of the DEI committee, Kevin, our producer extraordinaire, thank you all for attending, and please be mindful of all the DEI activities by visiting our DEI webpage. And Ashley will be returning. She doesn't know this, but we will definitely find a way to leverage her brilliance in another way in the future. So thank you, everybody. This concludes our webinar.
Thank you so much. I'm pasting the link to my Google Doc.
Okay.
If you'd like them. I had forgotten to paste them in earlier. I appreciate it.
Appreciate you.
All right,
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
thank you.